Absolutely. Well, good to see everybody tonight, and hope that our discussion will be beneficial. And as usual, as I tell you often, feel free to speak up, jump in anytime you got a thought. I think this section will be interesting, I think. We're talking about temptation, and we're looking at James chapter 1, verses 13 to 16. We had gotten into verses 13 and 14 a little bit 2 weeks ago, but I just want to go back over that just a little bit, and then we'll finish up that section of the part where it talks about temptation. And in this section, he's talking about temptation to do wrong. He's talking about temptation to sin. You remember 2 or 3 weeks ago, we were talking about temptation that's talked about beginning in verse 2, and he said, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations. And of course, we talked about that in terms of those being tests. It's not tests to do wrong, but all of us face different situations in life that try us in some way or another. You know, when we get into this section, we see that where the Bible talks about God can't be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. But the Bible talks about that he tempted Abraham. We didn't tempt Abraham to do wrong. He tested Abraham, just like you and I have different tests in life from time to time. It may be a financial difficulty that we're undergoing. It may be we lose a job. It may be we have a sick child. It may be that we have a child get in an accident. We may lose a loved one. All of these things are not temptations to do wrong, but they test our faith, I guess is the best way to put it. We're tried in some way or other to see whether we're going to pass that test or not. Matter of fact, in the early part there, when he's talking about the various temptations or trials, difficulties in life that we have to face, he's talking about the trying of your faith. In other words, the testing of your faith there in verse 3. Abraham's faith was tested. You know, when you ask that you're going to have a son of promise, and then then you wait 25 years for that son of promise to come into being, and then when he gets a little older, you're told to go out and to kill him, then that's the test of his faith. Abraham, of course, passed the test. And you have other situations that we've talked about Job many times, and you talk about Paul many times, and others that underwent very difficult situations in life, and those were tests, not tests to cause them to do wrong, but just tests in the sense of they were tried, and of course they passed the test with flying colors. Well, you and I have the same kind of thing, not to the degree that some of those old patriarchs had, and those in the New Testament, Old Testament. We haven't lost 10 children. You know, we haven't lost everything like Job did. We haven't been through the scourgings and beatings and the various things, the shipwrecks and the things that Paul describes in 2 Corinthians 11, but we are tested. But in this section, in verses 13 to 16, he's talking about those things that would tempt us to do wrong. And where does this come from? Where do these tests come from? And he's very explicit and very forthright. It didn't come from God. You know, a lot of times people have a tendency to blame God, and we need to be very careful, and even in terms of that was God's will that happened.
That's right.
We need to be very careful about that.
God made me this way. That's the reason I act that way.
He made me this way.
He made me have those lusts and desires.
Right, and I've heard that in discussion that I had with email discussion back and forth for weeks and weeks and weeks. Someone in our family about homosexuality, and that was one of the things that God made me this way. I can't help it because God, in essence, that God caused it. God made me this way. I can't help the way that I feel. And so when we attribute something to God, whether it's a trial or temptation to do wrong, or in the sense that we just talked about, that God willed that to happen. You know, somebody gets in a real bad accident and they're killed or they're hurt really, really bad. Well, it was God's will that that happened. You know, that's the way some people reason, and we need to be very careful attributing things to God that it's not God. There was another cause for that. Just like in the temptation to do wrong, we're going to find, where does it come from? It comes from us. It comes from within. It didn't come from God. God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. It's left out, with evil. That's an elliptical expression there. So if he can't be tempted to do evil, we know God doesn't sin, anything of the sort, but he doesn't tempt man to sin. He doesn't put a stumbling block in our way to see whether we're going to pass the test, the trying of the situation that we're in, to do wrong. He doesn't do that. Matter of fact, when we get down into verse 14 and 15, we find that it comes from within. It comes from us. Of course, there is the great tempter we know, Satan, that puts these things, the prince of the world, the prince of the power of the air, and so forth. But it didn't come from God. Now, I want to read. Well, let's just read it real quick. I know we read it before. But let no man say when he's tempted, verse 13, I'm tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. And you could add the words with evil. That's the point that he's making there. But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. So it didn't come from God. It came from within. Then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin. And sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. Do not err, my beloved brethren. I want to read, it's kind of short, I want to read Wayne Jackson's take on it. I thought he had some good points, and then when we get into it, we'll discuss it. And I've got a few points that Albert Barnes makes that I thought was real good. Jackson says this: there is a difference, I mean, this is what we talked about a while ago, there's a difference between trials or persecutions and temptations or solicitations to sin. Now, what we just talked about, what is discussed in verses 2 and 3 as opposed to what is discussed in verse 13 to 16. We have the test of our faith. Here we have a temptation to sin. So you got two different, you have the same word, temptation, but you have to look at the context in which it's given there. He says, though the same Greek word is used for both, only the context can separate the one from the other. In verse 14, James speaks of the latter, in other words, solicitations to sin. No one who is tempted to do something wrong should accuse God of being behind the maneuver. God is too holy to even contemplate sin, and he gives Habakkuk 1:13 as a reference. And he certainly never solicits others to sin, verse 13 of our reading. There is a sinister character known as the tempter, or the always tempting one, who is the specialist in temptations. And he gives Matthew 4:3 as an example, which we know the temptation of Jesus. And somehow, never explicitly explained, he uses our weaknesses to accomplish his devilish ambitions. Usually when we're at the most vulnerable, that's when things seem to happen that cause us to stumble, or something is placed before us that causes some type of going beyond what God would have us to do, but it doesn't come from God. In the final analysis, each person falls into sin when he is drawn away by his own desire and lured by his own bait, which is the way the Greek explains it. The progression of sin in one's life is portrayed under the imagery of physical gestation. Verse 15, lust or desire gives way to conception or intention. In other words, you have an intent to do something, so that's the next step in the process, which develops into outright action. Finally, the sin, even just one, results in death. Sin separates from God, and he gives Isaiah 59:1 and 2. We're familiar with all these verses. Ephesians 2 and verse 1, 1 Timothy 5 and verse 6. And if pardon is not sought, such leads to eternal separation from the Creator. 2 Thessalonians 1:9, we know that passage very well, and also Revelation 20 and verse 14. So let me read just a little bit, and y'all jump in anytime you got a thought on this. So he's talking about that James here seems to have had his eye on whatever there was in trial of any kind to induce us to commit sin. In other words, by complaining about it, by apostatizing, by murmuring, all the things that that we could do that we're not to do. He felt evidently that there was great danger, and I'm reading a couple of things from Clark. Not from Clark, what did I say? Albert Barnes, excuse me. The apostle felt evidently that there was great danger from the general manner in which the word temptation was used, and from the perverse tendency of the heart, that it would be charged to God that he so arranged these trials and so influenced the mind as to produce inducements to sin. In other words, that God is the one that put that in front of you or me to cause us to sin. Like he put Bathsheba on that roof so that David would be tripped up. You know, that's the kind of reasoning some people say. Well, God willed that or God did that. What he's saying in these verses is it doesn't happen that way. In other words, we have something inside of us where you're going to gratify certain senses or certain things that are inbred in us. For example, we have a desire for food. Well, can you sin in eating too much? The Bible talks about gluttony. So what he's saying is there is a sense in which whatever is there that we have a desire for, there are bounds to keep us in check. In other words, we have sensual gratification or sensual desires. Well, there's a way in which those things can be
There's an outlet for it.
done. There's an outlet for it, right?
You know,
So
David could have turned around and went back into the room, couldn't he?
right, exactly. But in his heart, he started, and what did he do? He lusted after her. And what is it? And I'm going to get to this a little bit later about lust and also coveting. But the what does the Bible say? Who looks after a woman to lust after her has done what?
Committed adultery through his heart.
Committed adultery already in his heart with her. So David went too far. Of course, we know that. As a matter of fact, that's the one thing that God talked about even later on. He talks about David, he was a man after God's own heart, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. And of course, we know the situation that caused all that.
Down in 17, that's a little bit ahead of you, but it says every good and perfect gift comes from above, comes down from the Father. And the last verse in Genesis said God had lived, but God looked at all he created. And he saw that it was very good.
Very good, yeah.
He didn't create man to be a homosexual or
Absolutely.
to have evil thoughts in his mind constantly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, after his creation there, you refer to Genesis 1:31, I think, where everything he created was very good. Up to that point, said everything was good, and then when he finished it,
Very good.
everything was very good. Kind of a word to modify good, adverb to modify good. To what degree it was very good.
When homosexuality entered into the world, we know before Noah that every thought of man was evil, so I'm sure it was there at that
Probably that, yeah.
Noah was there during Lot's time.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's nothing new.
Yeah.
It didn't start last week or
No. Been going on a long time. Just like adultery, just like prostitution, just like fornication. Been there a long time, and unfortunately to be there until the end of time. Charlie, go ahead.
In 1 Thessalonians 4:3 it says, "For this is the will of God, even your sanctification, that ye should abstain from fornication."
Absolutely. Matter of fact, we should even abstain from the appearance of evil, right? 1 Thessalonians 5. So,
Go to the pool hall, shoot pool anymore.
yeah, if it appears bad, Lord,
It don't look good.
now let it go. Don't walk in that pool room. Temptation, let me just read this. Nothing can be presented to God's mind as an inducement to do wrong. We're talking about, for God cannot be tempted with evil. He stands aloof from it. There's not anything that that he could be tempted with. There's nothing in him that has a tendency to do wrong or to induce him to do wrong. Neither tempteth he any man. Let's look at that phrase just a second. He places nothing, what Barnes says, I want to say Clark for some reason. He places nothing before any of us with a view to induce us or anyone else to do wrong. That's one of the most forthright, unambiguous statements in the Bible, that there's nothing. He doesn't tempt any man. He doesn't tempt any man. So any man that says, well, God caused that, or God led me in that direction, he's just flat wrong, because it's very, very explicit here. So it comes from within. Out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornication, lasciviousness, and you go on and on and on, murders, so forth and so on. Out of the heart. It didn't come from God. Now, he gave us the desire. He gave us the desire. He gave us the ability to choose. Aren't you glad that he gave us the ability to choose? Keith talks to football players a lot of times, don't be a robot. He didn't create robots. He created us with the ability to choose. Matter of fact, he said, I set before you good and evil, life and death. Choose life. Choose good. We have that choice. He doesn't make us. So the passage there simply states that all things must be held in consistency with the fact that God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. In verse 14, it starts the process of how that occurs. Every man is tempted when he's drawn away of his own lust and enticed. So the source of all temptation then is in man himself. I know we have to have help from the tempter sometimes. I'm not discounting that. But like the Lord said, you can resist. The Bible talks about resist the devil, he'll flee from you. So we have the ability to resist. But if we don't, if we give in to that thought, that it's going to lead to something that goes beyond the bounds to which we are restricted, I guess. Go ahead, Ezra.
Yes, sir. A few things about that will of God.
Yeah.
You know, it's the only will of God we understand and know is what He has told us, and that's
Absolutely.
in the Bible.
Yep.
So any particular acts we don't know. We can say, like the Apostle Paul, perhaps,
Yeah.
in terms of the good.
Yeah.
In terms of also temptation, I remember, I can't remember the exact passage, Brother Keith probably would, where Jesus told Peter that Satan desired to sift you as wheat.
Yeah.
And that's the way he does work,
Yep.
as I'm sure, because he has a roaring lion, walketh about whom he
Seeking
may
him.
devour. Seeking whom he
Absolutely.
may devour. In 1 Peter 5:8. But one of the reasons why that God cannot be tempted with evil was because he is not flesh. And that's one of the reasons why Christ came into this earth to be born of the flesh, to be tempted as all points like this.
We are.
He cannot be tempted with evil
Yeah.
because he's not flesh.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
so, and along those same lines, to tempt people with evil would be completely contrary to who he is. He would contradict himself.
Absolutely.
Because
Right.
all sin is transgression of his own law, and he's not going to lay that bait.
Absolutely.
That snare in front of people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Excellent points. Lord, yeah.
Well, like what Solomon says, there's a time for everything. You know, it's a time to love, a time to hate, a time to make war, a time to make peace. But there's a time for every need or desire we have in our life. The trouble is, especially when we're young, we don't want to wait for that time to get here. You know, we want it right now.
Exactly.
But there is, if we're patient enough and we wait on the Lord, all those things that we need in our life or think we need
Yeah,
it will show up eventually.
absolutely.
Also, Coach, on those same lines, even in the medical world, as they're noticing, Krista has a cousin. He began to act homosexual as a teenager because of the medication he was taking. And it was really odd because it ramped up estrogen in him. They took him off the medicine, it stopped. And so, I mean, I'm not trying to be conspiratorial or anything like that. There is apparently within us, when you were talking about we're created with certain urges, some people are tempted
Oh, yeah.
with pedophilia. I have the slightest idea what would cause one to do that. But there are apparently some people that are tempted in that direction. Some are tempted with other things and other weaknesses like homosexuality. Sorry, don't have any issue there. But somebody will. And I don't think there's no justification for it. As we know in terms of the difference between temptation and then transgression. And I know you're going to get into that too, Coach, but I just think there's some new things that cause people to struggle nowadays that the Bible hasn't changed, but what we've learned about certain things have changed.
Yeah.
Like you say, though, God would make someone a homosexual and then damn them to hell for being one.
No, I guess
Right.
that's completely opposite of him
Right,
still
his-
loving the world.
absolutely.
And his good nature.
Totally opposite of his nature.
Absolutely.
Now, you know you can't call them pedophiles anymore, Israel. You have to call them something like minor attracted, what do they call them now?
There you go. Just repackage that. Minor
Something-
attractive person.
Something with the radicals have come up with, I can't even, minor attractive persons or something, or I can't remember. So you're attracted to minors, but you're not a pedophile, you know?
I think
Jesus had
we're
something.
perverts. Good.
Yeah, that, I
Yeah,
mean,
you can't call them that now. Can't call them middle.
That's exactly what it is. But
Yeah.
Matthew 18,
It's perversion.
Jesus said,
Perversion.
better to have a millstone cast around those people.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, God already knows how we're going to react to it.
Yeah.
So why would he need to test us?
Yeah,
Now, we are tested,
yeah, but not to do wrong.
but not to do wrong.
Right.
Never to do evil.
Yeah, yeah. He tests us. You know, he plainly points that out in verses 2 and 3 of this chapter. He tested Abraham, tested Job. It was a test. You know, Job didn't know that's what it was. Abraham didn't know that's what it was. It was, but not to do wrong. You know, he wasn't trying to get Job to sin. He wasn't trying to get Abraham to sin. But it was a test. Go ahead, Charlie.
All right, in 1 Thessalonians 5:8, it says, "But let us who are of the day be sober, putting on the breastplate of faith and love, and putting a helmet, the hope of salvation."
Absolutely, absolutely. Good things for us to have in our life, isn't it? Absolutely. Well, in that, talk about every man is tempted when he's drawn away of his own lust. And just read a couple of statements. It is true that external inducements to sin may be placed before him, but they would have no force if there was not something in himself to which they corresponded, over which they might have power. There must be some lust, desire, inclination, something which is unsatisfied now, which has made the foundation of the temptation. In other words, it's not God, but it's something in us. We have an inclination to that, kind of like we have an inclination to eat, but you could go beyond. We have an inclination for sexual gratification, but it could be misplaced and become sin and so forth, or anything else that might be there. So whatever that propensity is, or whatever that inclination is, it has to be restrained. It has to be channeled, and we have the ability to do that. He's also given us the ability. Matter of fact, in 1 Corinthians 10, it says he provides a way of escape. May have to look for it, but he provides a way of escape. I think one of you guys mentioned that a while ago, that Lord or somebody, where he could have, David could have turned around when he was looking at Bathsheba. He could have turned around he could have quit staring, he could have gone back into the house or whatever,
And that's the
from his
hardest
roof.
thing though, Coach.
Yeah.
There's a crossroads right there.
There you go.
And one of the things when you read in Abraham's account, that Abraham, before he is told in Genesis 22, is meditating in chapter 21. He
Yeah.
was prepared.
Yeah,
He had been strengthening and building himself.
oh, yeah,
And that's really, I think, one of the great lessons of
Yeah.
how, because there is the rebellious sin and then there's the sin of weakness.
yeah,
And but Satan is dirty. He's going to catch you when you're
yeah,
off.
absolutely. Well, even Abraham, good point about Abraham, because even when God told him what he was going to do, when he saw the mountain afar off, and he and Isaac left the servants there, what did they say to the servants? We're going to go sacrifice, and we're going to come again. He had enough faith in God that even if he took his life, he was going to raise him from the dead. I don't know what his thinking was, but his faith was so strong that he was going to do what God told him to do, the father of the faithful and all that, friend of God. But Abraham kind of knew the outcome, it seems to me. Anyway, whatever he had to do, God was going to make it right somehow or other. That seemed to be the gist there, I think. Let me see. Let me just read another thing here. Okay, talking about every man is tempted when he's drawn away of his own lust and enticed. To draw away a man, entice him. Again, that comes from within. And so he's tracing the whole evil of temptation, which some falsely ascribe to God. But it's the sinful desires of the heart. As we said before, it doesn't come from God. I wanted to get into just a statement to here that Clark makes about the idea of lusting being a harmless. Some people say, well, it's harmless to lust. In other words, you can lust, but that's okay. You're not committing the act. And he gets into this a little bit. In other words, the inclination to do wrong. And he says it's so important that we don't look at it like that there's nothing wrong with that in itself, because then it could lead to the real thing. The culmination is going to be sin, and sin, when it's finished, brings forth death. I want to talk about a couple of things here in just a minute, but let me just read a statement to you makes here. He's talking about the idea of the apostle James here seems to be that of an enticing harlot. She persuades through her impure embrace, as it were. And the result of this union, you have the conception and then bringing forth actual sin, which bring forth death and so forth. So Paul, in other passages, talks about the fact that he wouldn't have known that this inward desire or this thing that's going to be forbidden was wrong, except when God said, for example, thou shalt not covet. Is it wrong to covet? One of the 10 Commandments, right?
Sure.
Thou shalt not covet. Well, I didn't take what was his, but I sure had a strong desire for it. So that's where we want to get to at this point. It's kind of like with the idea of lusting. We talked about it a while ago, that a person man who looks on a woman to lust after her has committed adultery within his heart. So did his lust, was it sin, even though he didn't culminate in the actual action? I've heard Keith talk about it a lot of times about when Christ gave his law there, and we look at the there in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, it was always on a higher plane. You've heard it had been said by them both times, so thou shalt not commit adultery, but I say unto you, it was always on a higher plane, taking it to another level. So when he says, if you look on a woman to lust after, you commit adultery in your heart, and even though you don't steal from your neighbor, you covet what he's got. Now, where stealing's wrong too, but you covet what he's got. In other words, it's the covet. I looked up that word. To long to possess something belonging to another person, strongly desiring another person's property. And that's where it's wrong. In other words, it's, we can have evil thoughts, can't we?
But if you had the opportunity, you would do it.
You might do it, right, there you
A
go.
man commits adultery with one with his heart, he may not commit adultery with
Right.
her. But if he had the opportunity.
If had time and opportunity,
He
right,
would.
absolutely.
Same way if coveting a person's possessions, oh, you got a nice car, if I had the opportunity, I'd get that car.
Yeah, right. And that's what he's talking about here, that even though you have the progression of sin, that's the reason I wanted to pause just a second on that point there, when lust has conceived, or when we entice, lust conceive, you entice, and that leads to sin, which leads to death. But the sin can actually be in the coveting, and the sin can actually be in the lusting. At least the way that I understand the concept there, what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, and what said there about well, I lost my train of thought. The lusting part of it, or the coveting part of it, even though it's not actually culminated in the actual act of taking something that doesn't belong to you. Go ahead, Ezra.
Yes, sir, just the scripture to go with that, Colossians, I think it's 3:5, or Ephesians 5:15 or so. It says covetousness is idolatry.
Idolatry. There you go. Good point. I wish I'd have thought of that one. That's good. That's good. That's right. I got you guys in class. Set them straight. Give me some good thoughts there. That's good. Absolutely. And then in verse 15, he says, then when lust hath conceived, then it brings forth death. Death when it brings sin when it's finished brings forth death. So let me just read the statement to you makes here. The meaning is, when the desire which we have naturally is quickened or made alive or made to act, the result is that sin is produced. As our desires of good lie in the mind by nature, and our inclinations exist as they were created, they cannot be regarded as sin or treated as such. But when they are indulged, when plans of gratification are formed, when they are developed in actual life, the effect of sin, in the mere desire of good, of happiness, of food, of raiment, there's no sin. It becomes sin which indulged in an improper manner, and when it leads to seek that which is forbidden, or to invade the rights of others, or any way to violate the laws of God. But my point is, and I understand what he's saying there, but my point is, it even goes beyond that, because if you are lusting, or if you are coveting, that's wrong as well, and we got to get that straightened out. But he does make some good points in that regard. So, but it can't be traced to God. So let me move on real quick. And sin, when it's finished, bringing forth death. The result of sin, when it's fully carried out, is death. Death in all forms. Whatever form the death exists is traced to sin. That sin will naturally and regularly produce it. We can talk about death entered into the world because of sin, physical death, and also spiritual death. You can look at it both ways from that standpoint. Let's see. Let me just read just one other thing here. He says, the reflection, anyone who indulges in a sinful thought or corrupt desire should reflect that it may end in death temporal and eternal. Its natural tendency will be to produce such a death. This reflection should induce us to check an evil thought or desire at the beginning. Not for one moment should we indulge in it, for soon it may secure the mastery and be beyond our control. So what he's saying is, if we don't check it, like what he said in 1 Thessalonians 5, abstain even from the appearance of evil. So when it looks like it could lead to something, what he's saying is, we need to check it right there, lest it, like Laura was talking about, where you really want to do that, or you really want to possess what your neighbor has, or you really want that woman, or you really, whatever the case might be. So it needs to be checked early, he said, before it leads to eternal separation from God. And then in verse 16, do not err, my beloved brethren. So he seems to be following up with what he just said, And the main thought there was, when he says, do not err, my beloved brethren, he seems to be following up with what he said about God. God cannot be tempted with evil. In other words, don't lay it on God. It's not God, it's us. Here's the progression. Here's the progression of sin. So do not err in thinking it's some other way than what the Bible describes it there. So some people were seen to be thinking that God was the author of it. What he's saying is that God is not the author of it, to the point that, as Lloyd was pointing out a while ago, when he gets to verse 17, and we'll just read that, in other words, do not err, my brethren, in thinking that God caused that, or God can be tempted with evil, or he tempts man with evil. Do not think that. Do not err in thinking that, because every good and perfect gift is from above. So when he's leading into that, he's contrasting. He's contrasting man's thinking that God had something to do with it, with the fact that it can't be God, because every good and perfect gift is from Him. You can see the contrast with what he's saying in verses 13 and 14 with what he actually says in verse 17. Go ahead, Ezra.
Yes, sir. There's a man who wrote a book, I have it in my library, it's called Every Man's Battle. And the idea, of course, is it deals with the lust that men particularly struggle with women. And this gentleman talked about how it started for him. Of course, this was written back when ads for women's clothing were put in newspaper. And he said that started it with him. But where he was going is that he took the step in the wrong direction to begin with. And that's the thing, it seems to be, not just particularly that particular sin, but not going down the slippery slope.
Right.
Taking
Exactly.
that first step. And I guess
Exactly.
that's what we have to be thinking about.
Yeah.
You know, what is it that's going to, it's like someone has put it, it's like running red lights. Would you take and drive down Highway 59 and just run all the lights?
Yeah.
Well, why would you do that, say, in a relationship between, or a professional relationship or
Right.
anything? You're running a red light, you know, that
Yep.
kind of stuff needs to stop.
Mm-hmm.
And just noticing what's a red light, what's a yellow light, and those, you know, because I know it's something that,
Yep.
that's what we have to deal with.
Absolutely.
There's
Absolutely.
a caution light there if we see it, isn't it, before
Yes,
we
sir.
turn red.
Yes, sir, and so when you run it, you know, do something, you know, and
Yep.
he would use the example, this particular speaker, that there was a certain coworker that he was a teacher, and then next thing you know, he saw this one lady, and then next thing he was making his way to make sure
Yeah.
that he's running in the same direction,
Right.
meeting up with her.
Yeah.
And he was running red lights.
And going and being enticed, just
Yes, sir.
leading a little bit further along.
Right,
Yep.
and you know, recognizing those things, I think, is what would, you know, be, and not just that, but you can take and apply that to anger,
Yeah.
or any other sin.
Any other sin? Yep.
Gambling, drinking, you know, don't take the first sip, you don't have a problem.
Yep.
So,
Just starts little by little, and then, but we've got to put the brakes on at some point, right?
Yes.
In other words, if you start, like you said, that first step, you got to put the brakes on
right,
and back up, look the other way, you know?
yes, sir.
Don't get that second look, third look, and just a little bit
It's all
closer.
an
Don't see how far, don't get out, see how close we can get to it,
Yes, sir.
and still not cross the line. You know, that's what some people do. They see how close they get. Well, I didn't cross the line.
Sir.
I got close, but I didn't cross the line. Need to stay as far away. Flee fornication, flee temptation, flee idolatry, flee all these other things. Run away from it, stay away from it. Go ahead, Charlie.
Appearances.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Charlie. Sorry.
Good turn, Charlie.
Your turn, my
All
man.
right, in 2 Timothy 4, this, verse 3, it says, "For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine,
Absolutely.
but their own lusts, shall they heap themselves teachers of having itchy ears."
Yeah, there's that word lust coming in again, right? Absolutely. And then in verse 17, every good gift, every perfect gift is from above. That the general sense seems to be that God is the author of all good. Everything that is good on the earth, we can trace to Him. Evil has another origin. Everything that's good comes from God. As the Lord said, Genesis 1:31, it was very good. Everything He's made was very good. He made it for man, and of course, man early on decided to go in a different direction. So it's from above, it's from God. In heaven, cometh down from the Father of lights. He's described as the Father of lights, physically and in every other way, spiritually. If you look at the sun and the moon and the stars, if you look at it from that standpoint, He's the Father of all light. In the very beginning, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So He's the author of all light from the very beginning. And then when he set the sun and moon and the stars in the sky to regulate the days and nights and years and so forth, He's the author of all of that. And He's the author of all moral light, not just and all spiritual light, all moral light, all of the things that have to do with purity and light and so forth. He's the author of that. It should be traced back to Him, not anything that is evil. As a matter of fact, He doesn't change. He says, "With whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning." When you look at the sun and look at the earth and the rotation and everything, what He's saying is that even though that is natural, God doesn't change. God is there. God is there all the time. Even these things that change, God is unchangeable. There's no change in no variableness in Him, and that's the point that He's making. We'll take up there next week and then try to get a few more verses down the pike than we got tonight. Thank you guys for your good attention and your good comments. I appreciate that.